Okay, this is the audio review of Race as Class and Is Capitalism Gendered and Racialized? Alright, so race, class, and status. So Herbert Gans points out in the reading how biologists argue that scientifically there can't be human races. But despite this, the majority of people still see and distinguish between races. So he wonders why should a thing that's about melatonin still structure so much social inequality in our lives. Skin colors and facial features commonly used to define race because when we arrange them hierarchically, they resemble the country's class and status hierarchy, with whites on the top and non-whites having less prestige and lower socioeconomic stances. So these things are intricately connected. So race functions as more than a class marker. It's important to point that out. The correlation between race and class is not statistically perfect, but there is a strong enough relationship that we socially use race as a marker of social class. So Gans argues that other factors indicate socioeconomic status, but a lot of these distinctions are getting less noticeable, making race even more important as a marker of socioeconomic status in America. When examining the historical background, since the first settlers, race was established as a social hierarchy that affected livelihood and power. At the bottom of the hierarchy were indentured servants, slaves, and Native Americans. In order to justify slavery, the othering of Africans was necessary, so we could still be a nation of freedom while literally denying any freedom to African Americans. Whenever there's an inequality in society, there's always a social justification there to defend it. So different groups have been maligned throughout U.S. history due to their race or ethnicity, as many immigrants were needed in different waves over time to supplement industry and fill otherwise open jobs. But once that group was no longer as exploitable as economically necessary, they're vilified in the culture and then often denied the legal rights and status of white Americans. So in the reading, the concept of African American exceptionalism is discussed, meaning no matter how much wealth, status, prestige a person has, if they're African American, they're still raced, right, socially. So they're associated with lower social class status, lower prestige and status because of the racial stereotypes in the culture. So when we talk about upward mobility, this is not easy when you're racialized. So some see race as the heart of an issue connecting race and class, because both prejudice and institutional discrimination connect to these factors. So other explanations, again, are class related. So many blacks were kept away from opportunities that would have afforded them social mobility, like we talked about with the GI Bill. So as a result, there are many black people still stuck in poverty in impoverished neighborhoods or locked in the system of mass incarceration, right? And so when you have no opportunities, no structured education, you're going to take what you can get, right? And that's happening with a lot of people joining the underground economy to keep themselves housed, to keep themselves fed and clothed, right? To try and have some standard of living. So we have to really look at the context of these things to understand them better. So there's so many social stereotypes that see African Americans as suited for service jobs. And through legal racist caste systems like slavery and Jim Crow segregation, even though those are over, many institutional barriers to success remain. So daily life in a white-dominated society reminds many people that they're perceived as inferior if they're racial or ethnic minorities. And these reminders are louder and more relentless for the poor, especially for young men. So this lack of opportunity can really cause despair and resentment. It almost kind of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy for not having success in American society. So some of the implications are keeping African Americans from decent jobs and incomes, as well as quality schooling and housing. So this also means that more of these things are available to people that have privilege or racialized privilege. So discrimination and segregation may decline significantly only if the rules of the competition change, or if scarce resources such as decent jobs become more plentiful so that we can relax competition. Otherwise, these issues continue, right? So when jobs left inner city areas after white flight, nothing came to replace them. And as a result of that, we see people locked and stuck in endemic poverty because of policies like redlining, as we've discussed, right? So when looking towards the multiracial future, this complicates our notion of status and worth, but we can only hope that over time, we can stop classifying each other's worth based on melatonin in our skin and instead based on a person's character and actions. Okay, moving on to, is capitalism gendered and racialized? Hint, yes. Okay, so the gendered and racialized development of U.S. capitalism. So the reading talks about how capitalism is gendered and racialized through two intersecting historical processes. The first is the industrial capitalism that dominated by white males, which created gender and race segregated labor forces with wage inequalities and a society-wide gender division of caring labor. The second is that gendered and racialized practices are embedded in and replicated through the gendered substructures of capitalism itself. So when we segregate work and inequality, and we look at these financial compensations being different, this is by design. This is not by accident. So separating caring labor from the economy and preferencing some kinds of work over others, and some, are worth paying more for and some are not, like child rearing, house cleaning, things that are associated with kind of traditional gender notions of a female's role do not have value, do not have compensation, and if they do, they're very low compensation, right? But they're basically labor that needs to be done, right? If someone doesn't do the laundry, you don't have clothes to wear to your fancy capitalism job, right? So, if someone doesn't get the groceries, you have nothing to eat, right? If someone doesn't clean the house, then you're just living in filth. So the idea is that capitalism itself is structured, built on these inequalities. Industrial capitalism is a historically white male project, and it continues to be so in the modern era. So this means that white men are the owners of industry predominantly, and those who hold the most power in society. So capitalism, like other parts of society, was affected by the ideology of the time period in which it was formed, that valued white men above all other social groups, as it was formed in Britain, Europe, and the United States. So we see these inequalities being reified generationally. So when it comes to segregation and wage inequalities, capitalism was built on the forced labor institution of slavery, and wage labor force was sharply divided by gender as well as by race and ethnicity. So the gender division of labor became the divide in paid and unpaid labor. So Omi went on to argue that the U.S. was a racial dictatorship for 258 years, from 1607 to 1865. After the abolition of slavery in 1865, severe exploitation, exclusion, and domination of blacks by whites perpetuated racial divisions, which cut across gender and some class divisions, consigning blacks to the most menial, low-paid jobs in agriculture, mining, and domestic service. So early industrial workers were also largely immigrants. So the gender and racial ethnic division of labor that still exists, but now it's on steroids, right? It's on a global basis. The experiences of racial oppression are now built into industrial capitalism. So when we export that around the world through globalization, it gets built into these systems that have these gender biases, these racial and ethnic value systems built into who gets paid what and who has what value. So women from different racial and ethnic groups were incorporated differently than men, and differently from each other into developing capitalism in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Unequal pay patterns went along with sex and race segregation and exclusion. So differences in the earnings and wealth of women and men became a part of the structure of capitalism itself, as unequal wages were justified by beliefs about virtue and entitlement. White men were seen as the most capable and suited for the most valued and highly paid positions in society. So beliefs about different groups and their social value affects their job opportunities and wages. So these men had advantages that they used to shore up more opportunities and power in the labor market, such as forming unions that were racially segregated. So white masculine identity and the self-respect that comes with it were complexly involved in these divisions of labor and wages. So as time goes by and history takes place, these patterns continually recreate. So those gender and racial inequalities kind of get built into it generationally as essential elements present in capitalism. So segregating practices are now a part of history, right? These white, masculine-dominated capitalism has established this class and gendered, racialized structures. So even as more women and people of color enter fields that were dominated by white men, such as politics, the actions of those who hold leadership positions, their actions, are still shaped within networks and practices sustained by those kind of white, heteronormative images of masculinity. So globalization has moved the horrible factory conditions from 100 years ago in the United States to places all over the world. And since we're divorced from where our products come from, we rarely reflect on our part in the extreme exploitation of others needed to support our current American lifestyle. So I included the video about the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire to illustrate how the exploitation of the past is connected to the exploitation of today. It's just often out of sight, out of mind. And then lastly, when it comes to masculinities in capitalism, some challenge the notion of masculinity as a singular ideal and argue that we should refer to them as masculinities because in any society at any one time, there are several ways of being a man. Being a man involves cultural images and practices. It always implies a contrast to an unidentified femininity. So hegemonic masculinity is defined as the taken for granted form attributed to leaders and other influential figures at particular historical times. Hegemonic masculinity legitimizes the power of those who embody it. More than one type may exist simultaneously, such as being a CEO or a professional athlete. Right? Those are two forms, but there's related aspects of that kind of performance that we expect. So the ideology of capitalist markets is imbued with masculine ethos. Masculinity and the ideology behind it continue to be a part of the shaping of ongoing capitalism. Hegemonic masculinities and violence are deeply connected within capitalistic history. So the violence of colonialism, right, meaning the genocide, forced relocations, cultural genocides, the slave trade, slavery as an institution, and violence in all of these forms are linked to power, the power of some to control the lives of others. So metaphors of violence shape understandings of masculinities. To be at the top of the corporate ladder is to dominate, to conquer, right? Or in institutions like the police force or the military, the ability to wield violence is linked to masculine performance and abilities. So when you look at different cultures, their hegemonic masculinities have similarities and differences. So each culture has their own slice of these issues related to their social and cultural histories. Hegemonic masculinities are also defined in contrast to subordinate masculinities, whether it be by class, race, sexuality. So again, men are not a monolithic category. Your experience of masculinity is going to differ based on your social class, your race, your ethnicity, all sorts of other factors, social class. And these masculinities are not stable images and ideas. There's things that change with the changes in society. So one way I wanted to illustrate this briefly was the kind of gendered notions we have around leadership. So here on the left I have from fortune.com, this is research that was done about who receives negative feedback, right, in performance evaluations. And you can see that it's very different depending on gender, whether it has negative feedback or has only constructive feedback. And then when looking at reviews including critical feedback, you see, who's receiving criticism and who's not. So it's the same kind of inverse idea. So the idea here is that the bias that we have against women in leadership roles that sees them as, aggressive or a bitch and not as a boss or in charge, assertive, we have very different ways to understand who's performing those roles. So our gendered biases that say that women are subservient, are caring, are, effeminate and weak, really don't vibe with the reality of so many women in leadership positions, right? But the cultural stereotypes, the notions that women should be subservient, should be caring, should be, kind of reduced to these very patriarchal notions of child rearing and comforting and all that kind of fun stuff. It really goes against our notions of what a leader is because what has been constructed as a leader over time was so closely connected to masculinities.